In the annals of unexplained phenomena, few incidents have captivated public imagination, quite like the Pinewood Creek incident of April 2025. What began as an ordinary spring evening in a sleepy mountain town would soon escalate into one of the most documented yet inexplicable confrontations between humanity and the unknown. The events that unfolded at the Pinewood Creek Police Station on April 22, 2025, would forever change our understanding of what lurks in the shadows of North America's vast wilderness. Pinewood Creek, nestled in the dense forests of the Pacific Northwest, had always been a town of quiet routine. With a population barely exceeding 3,000 souls, it was the kind of place where everyone knew everyone, where the most exciting event of the year was the annual Lumber Festival, and where the local police force spent more time helping elderly residents with minor inconveniences than combating any real crime. The police station itself, a modest two-story brick building constructed in the early 1970s, stood at the edge of town, marking the boundary between civilization and the ancient forest that stretched unbroken for hundreds of miles beyond. Sheriff Thomas Reeves had served Pinewood Creek for nearly 20 years. A man of imposing stature with a full beard now streaked with gray, Reeves was respected throughout the community for his fair-minded approach to law enforcement and his intimate knowledge of the surrounding wilderness. Like many residents of Pinewood Creek, Reeves had grown up with the forest as his playground, learning its secrets and developing a deep respect for its mysteries. "You never truly know what's out there," he would often remark to new deputies joining his small force. "The forest keeps its secrets close." It was a sentiment passed down through generations in Pinewood Creek, a subtle acknowledgement of the unexplained phenomena that occasionally touched the edges of their community. Strange sounds echoing from deep in the woods on still nights, unusually large footprints discovered by hikers, livestock that went missing only to be found days later in inexplicable locations. For most residents, these occurrences were simply part of life in Pinewood Creek, fodder for fireside stories, but not a source of genuine concern. Sheriff Reeves, however, maintained a private collection of reports dating back decades, detailed accounts of encounters too bizarre to be officially filed, yet too consistent to be dismissed as mere imagination. The events of April 2025 began, innocuously enough. Spring had arrived earlier than usual that year, bringing with it an explosion of new growth and wildlife activity. By mid-April, the forest surrounding Pinewood Creek was alive with the sounds of birds, the scent of wildflowers, and the movement of creatures emerging from their winter dormancy. Deputy Samantha Chen, the newest addition to Reeves's small force of 6 officers, was the first to notice something unusual. A former wildlife biologist who had traded her research career for law enforcement after the pandemic shifted funding priorities, Chen possessed a keen eye for ecological abnormalities. On April 18th, while patrolling the forest road that circled the town's perimeter, she noticed an unusual pattern of behavior among the local wildlife. "The animals are acting strange," she reported to Sheriff Reeves during their shift change briefing. "It's like they're avoiding certain areas of the forest entirely. I've seen deer, raccoons, even predators like coyotes all giving the northwestern sector a wide berth." Reeves nodded thoughtfully. In his experience, wildlife behavior often provided the first indication of changes in the forest. Whether it was an approaching storm, a wildfire smoldering in remote areas, or something else entirely. "Keep an eye on it," he instructed Chen. "Document any changes you observe. Could be nothing. Maybe a new predator has moved into the territory, a cougar or a bear, but best to stay alert." Over the next 3 days, Chen's observations grew increasingly concerning. The zone of avoidance expanded, and with it came reports from locals living at the forest edge. Jared McKinley, whose cabin sat farther into the woods than any other residents, called the station on April 20th. His voice tight with poorly concealed anxiety. "Something's out there, Sheriff," McKinley reported. "Last 2 nights I've heard movement around my property. Not like any animal I know, heavy, deliberate, and there's a smell. Hard to describe it, but it's like wet fur and something something rot sweet underneath. Reeves dispatched deputies Chen and Mike Orozco to check on McKinley's property. They found the man visibly shaken, standing guard on his porch with a shotgun across his lap. A thorough inspection of the perimeter revealed unusual tracks in the eye. Soft earth, extraordinarily large, with 5 distinct toe impressions that resembled a human foot in overall shape, but dwarfed the deputy's own footprints in size. "I've never seen anything like this," Chen murmured, crouching to examine the prints more closely. She estimated them to be nearly 18 inches in length and proportionally wide, pressed deeply into the soil in a way that suggested a creature of considerable weight. Orozco, a lifelong resident of Pinewood Creek and an avid hunter, shook his head in disbelief. "No known animal makes tracks like these," he said, his hand instinctively moving to rest on his holstered weapon. "But I've heard stories." The unfinished thought hung in the air between them. In Pinewood Creek, as in many towns bordering the vast wilderness areas of the Pacific Northwest, stories of Sasquatch, the elusive ape-like creature said to inhabit the remote forests, were part of the cultural fabric. Most considered these tales to be little more than local color, entertaining, folklore to share around campfires. But for some, particularly those who spent significant time in the deepest parts of the forest, the possibility of something unknown lurking in the wilderness remained an open question. Chen, with her scientific background, maintained a healthy skepticism. "Let's collect samples and take measurements," she suggested, already reaching for the evidence kit in their patrol vehicle. "Whatever made these prints, it's a biological entity, not a ghost story." They documented the scene thoroughly, taking plaster casts of the clearest footprints and collecting hair samples found snagged on the rough bark of a tree at the edge of McKinley's clearing. The hair, thick, coarse, and unusually long, was a rusty brown color that matched no local wildlife Chen could identify. When they returned to the station with their evidence and report, Sheriff Reeves listened intently, his weathered face betraying little emotion. After they finished, he was silent for a long moment, then opened a filing cabinet behind his desk that few deputies had ever seen him access. From it, he withdrew a worn leather journal. "This isn't the first time," he said finally, laying the journal on his desk. "My predecessor kept records, as did the sheriff before him. Every few decades we get a cluster of sightings, unusual tracks, livestock disturbances. It follows a pattern. Activity increases for a few weeks, then gradually tapers off." He opened the journal, revealing pages of meticulous notes, sketches, and pressed into its pages, several Polaroid photographs yellowed with age. One, dated October 1977, showed a plaster cast of a footprint remarkably similar to those Chen and Orozco had documented that day. "So, what are we dealing with?" Orozco asked, his voice low. "You think it's really—" He couldn't bring himself to say the word, as if naming the creature might somehow summon it. Reeves closed the journal carefully. "I think we're dealing with something that doesn't fit neatly into our understanding of the world," he said. "Something that's been moving through these forests for generations. Usually it keeps its distance, but occasionally, for reasons we don't understand, it seems to grow curious about us." "Or territorial," Chen suggested, thinking of the wildlife avoidance patterns she'd observed. Reeves nodded slowly. "That's also a possibility, which is why we're going to increase patrols along the forest perimeter, especially near residences. I want daily checks on McKinley and the other outlying properties. And let's keep this between us for now. No need to start a panic based on some unusual tracks and sounds." What none of them could have known then was that the situation was already escalating beyond unusual tracks and sounds. That very night, as darkness settled over Pinewood Creek, multiple residents on the town's northwestern edge reported hearing strange vocalizations from the forest. Not quite human, not quite animal, but something unnervingly between. High-pitched whistles followed by deep, throaty howls that seemed to reverberate through the very ground. At the Wilkinson farm, approximately 2 miles from town, something broke through the fence of the cattle pasture, causing a stampede that resulted in 3 cows being fatally injured. When Dennis Wilkinson investigated at first light, he discovered not only more of the massive footprints, but also tufts of that same rusty brown hair caught in the broken fence posts. By April 21st, the day before the incident that would put Pinewood Creek on front pages across the country, Sheriff Reeves had quietly mobilized his entire department. Deputies worked in pairs, patrolling the forest edge and checking on remote properties. The evidence continued to accumulate: more footprints, more auditory encounters, and increasingly, reports of briefly glimpsed movement among the trees. A massive bipedal figure, covered in thick hair, moving with surprising speed and agility through terrain that would challenge even the most experienced human hiker. That evening, as the sun dipped below the mountains, casting long shadows across Pinewood Creek, Sheriff Reeves called an emergency meeting with Mayor Eleanor Hancock. In the privacy of the mayor's office, he shared the journal and the mounting evidence his deputies had collected. "We might need to consider evacuation of the properties closest to the forest edge," Reeves suggested grimly. "Whatever this is, it's showing more boldness than any previous cycle of activity. I'm concerned about public safety." Mayor Hancock, a practical woman in her 60s who had guided Pinewood Creek through everything from economic downturns to natural disasters, studied the evidence with a furrowed brow. "You realize what you're suggesting, Tom? That we evacuate citizens because of what most people would consider a campfire myth?" "I'm suggesting we take precautions based on observable evidence," Reeves countered. "Something large and potentially dangerous is moving in our forests. Whether it's a known species or something else entirely is secondary to ensuring community safety." Their debate continued late into the evening, ultimately reaching a compromise. They would increase police presence and issue a public advisory for residents to remain indoors after dark, citing unusual wildlife activity as the reason. Emergency. Evacuation plans were prepared but would only be activated if the situation escalated further. As Sheriff Reeves drove back to the station shortly before midnight, the forest to his right seemed unusually dark and silent, as if holding its breath. The hairs on the back of his neck stood up, an instinctive response he'd learned to trust over his decades in law enforcement. Something was watching him from those dense shadows. Something that understood far more than any ordinary animal should. He accelerated slightly, one hand moving to the reassuring presence of his service weapon. In the rearview mirror, for just a moment, he thought he saw movement at the forest's edge, a massive silhouette briefly illuminated by his taillights before melting back into the darkness. At the station, Deputies Chen and Ben Walker were monitoring the radio, logging reports from the other officers in the field. The atmosphere was tense, charged with anticipation and an underlying current of fear that no one wanted to acknowledge openly. "Anything new?" Reeves asked as he hung his jacket by the door. "2 more calls from the northwest quadrant," Chen reported. "Strange sounds. Something moving around properties but not approaching structures directly. Deputy Orozco and Lewis are checking it out now." Reeves nodded, pouring himself a cup of coffee from the pot that had likely been sitting too long. "And the samples you collected? Any insights?" Chen hesitated. "I sent the hair samples to a college friend in the biology department at Pacific Northwest University. She's confused. Says it doesn't match any known species in their database. Closest analog is primate, but with some unusual characteristics." The radio crackled to life before Reeves could respond, Deputy Orozco's voice coming through with an urgency that immediately commanded everyone's attention. "Station, this is Unit 4. We've got—" Christ, you're not going to believe this. "Visual confirmation, approximately 200 yards into the tree line off Cascade Road. It's exactly what you'd think. At least 8 feet tall, bipedal, moving, upright. It's watching us, Sheriff. Watching and not running away." The room fell silent, the implications of Orozco's report settling over them like a physical weight. This was no longer about unusual tracks or strange sounds. This was direct visual confirmation from trained observers of something that shouldn't exist, at least not according to conventional understanding. Unit 4, maintain your distance, Reeves instructed, his voice steady despite the adrenaline now coursing through his system. Do not approach, do not threaten, observe and report only. Copy that, Orozco's voice came back unnaturally tight. But Sheriff, it's moving, not away from us, toward town. The words hung in the air, ominous in their simplicity. Whatever had been lurking in the forests around Pinewood Creek, whatever had been gradually increasing its activities over the past days, was no longer content to remain on the periphery. It was moving with apparent purpose toward the human settlement. As if to underscore this new reality, the power in the station flickered once, twice, and then failed completely, plunging them into darkness broken only by the emergency lights that cast eerie, insufficient pools of illumination through the building. Generator should kick in, Deputy Walker murmured, moving toward the window to look outside. Whole town's dark. Could be a transformer. But Sheriff Reeves, with a certainty that came from decades of trusting his instincts, knew this was no ordinary power failure. As he reached for the emergency protocols manual, a sound reached them even through the solid walls of the station. A long, ululating howl that seemed to rise from the very depths of the earth, building to a pitch and intensity that made the windows vibrate in their frames. It was a sound that had no place in the modern world, a primal call that reached into the most ancient parts of the human brain and awakened forgotten fears. It was the sound of boundaries being crossed, of an ancient order being disrupted. It was the sound of what was coming for Pinewood Creek Police Station on that fateful night of April 22, 2025. As the howl faded, leaving behind a silence more terrifying than the sound itself, Sheriff Reeves met the eyes of his deputies, seeing in them the same realization that had settled in his own mind. The forest had kept its secrets for generations, but tonight, whatever dwelled in its depths was about to reveal itself, and the small police station at the edge of Pinewood Creek would be the unlikely setting for a confrontation between humanity and the unknown. The night stretched before them, dark and full of possibility, as they prepared for whatever would come with the breaking dawn. Or perhaps sooner. None of them could have predicted the full extent of what the next 24 hours would bring, an ordeal that would test not only their courage and resourcefulness, but also their very understanding of the world and their place in it. The emergency. Generators at Pinewood Creek Police Station sputtered to life with a mechanical whine, bathing the interior in the harsh glow of backup lighting. Sheriff Reeves moved with the calm efficiency of a man who had prepared for emergencies his entire career, though certainly not this specific emergency. Walker, establish radio contact with Orozco and Lewis. Chen, pull up the evacuation protocols for the Northwest Sector. I'm calling the mayor. His voice betrayed none of the tension that had settled like a physical weight across his shoulders. As deputies Chen and Walker sprang into action, Reeves reached for the satellite phone they kept for emergencies when standard communications failed. The regular phone lines were already dead, a fact he noted with grim resignation. "Eleanor, it's Tom," he said when Mayor Hancock answered, his voice low and measured. "We have a situation developing. I need you to activate the emergency alert system. Priority Level 1 evacuation for all properties within a half-mile of the forest edge." On the other end of the line, the mayor's protest was immediate and expected. "Tom, do you understand what you're asking? Waking people in the middle of the night, forcing them from their homes based on visual confirmation from my deputies," Reeves cut in, his tone brooking no argument. "And multiple corroborating reports. Eleanor, whatever's out there is moving toward town, and it's not behaving like any normal wildlife. We need to act now, before—" His words were interrupted by a sound from outside, a deep, resonant impact that vibrated through the building's foundation. Then another, and another, rhythmic, deliberate, like footsteps, but carrying a weight that no human could possess. Tom, what was that? The mayor's voice had lost its administrative crispness, revealing the fear underneath. Just activate the alert, Eleanor. Now. Reeves ended the call and turned to his deputies, whose attention was fixed on the windows facing the forest edge, though the blinds were drawn. That's not Orozco or Lewis, Walker said unnecessarily, his hand moving to the service weapon at his hip. Before Reeves could respond, the radio crackled to life. "Station, this is Unit 4, came Orozco's voice, tense but controlled. "Subject has moved beyond our position, traveling east-northeast, directly toward your location. We're in pursuit, but maintaining distance as ordered." "Copy that, Unit 4, Reeves responded. "Mayor is activating evacuation protocols. Once that's underway, I want you to assist with the northwest sector. Do not, I repeat, do not engage the subject." "Understood. But Sheriff—" Orozco hesitated, background noise suggesting he was moving through dense forest. "You should know. There might be more than one." The implications of this new information settled over the room like a shroud. One 8-foot cryptid was an anomaly, a biological curiosity, perhaps even a scientific revelation. Multiple such creatures represented something else entirely. Society, a species, an intelligence that had somehow remained hidden despite mankind's relentless expansion and documentation of the natural world. Another impact shook the building, closer now. Something large had entered the parking lot that separated the police station from the forest's edge. "Kill the lights," Reeves ordered, and Walker immediately hit the breaker for the emergency generator. The station plunged into darkness, broken only by the faint silver glow of moonlight filtering through the blinds. In the sudden silence, their breathing seemed impossibly loud. Then came another sound from outside, not the heavy footsteps, but something more disturbing. A series of vocalizations, clicks, whistles, and low guttural sounds that formed patterns too regular, too structured to be random animal noises. "They're communicating," Chen whispered, her scientific mind still analyzing despite the fear evident in her voice. "That's language, syntax. They're coordinating." Sheriff Reeves moved to the window, carefully parting the blinds just enough to peer into the parking lot. What he saw there would remain etched in his memory for the rest of his life. 3 massive figures stood in the open space between the forest and the station. The moonlight revealed shaggy silhouettes that stooped slightly at the shoulders but still towered well above the height of any human. Their bodies were covered in thick fur that appeared dark in the limited light, moving slightly in the spring breeze. They stood upright, unmistakably bipedal, with proportions that resembled an exaggerated human form. But it was their behavior that sent a chill down Reeves's spine. They weren't roaming randomly or investigating out of simple curiosity. They moved, with clear purpose, spreading out to flank the building in what could only be described as tactical positioning. The largest of the 3, standing at what Reeves estimated to be nearly 9 feet tall, remained in front of the main entrance, its massive head tilted slightly, as if listening or perhaps smelling the air. "They're surrounding us," Reeves whispered, letting the blind fall back into place. "Chen, Walker, weapon check, but keep them holstered. Let's not escalate unless absolutely necessary." As they verified their firearms, a shrill alarm cut through the night, the town's emergency system activating. A recorded message began to repeat, echoing through the quiet streets of Pinewood Creek. "This is an emergency evacuation notice for all residents within a half-mile of the forest boundary. Proceed immediately to the community center. This is not a drill." The effect on the creatures outside was immediate and electrifying. The rhythmic alarm, so unnatural in the quiet mountain, Setting provoked a response that Reeves observed through a narrow gap in the blinds. The three massive beings turned toward the sound, then back to the station. The large one at the entrance raised its head and released a howl that seemed to physically press against the windows, a sound of such raw power and ancient fury that everyone inside the station felt it resonate in their chest cavities. Then, with shocking suddenness, it charged. The impact of its massive body against the station's front doors bent the metal frame and shattered the reinforced glass panels. The security system wailed in protest as the doors held, but just barely, the deadbolts and frame visibly strained from a single impact. "Positions!" Reeves shouted, drawing his weapon as the training of decades took over. "Chen, the side exit. Walker, with me at the front. Remember, defensive posture only." As they took up positions to defend the building's entry points, the key radio burst to life again. This time it was Deputy Lewis, his usual laconic manner replaced by breathless urgency. "Station, we've got a situation all through the northwest sector. Multiple subjects, at least 6, maybe more. They're hurting people, Sheriff. Not attacking, not yet, but blocking escape routes to the west, pushing residents toward town." "What do you mean, hurting?" Reeves demanded, even as another tremendous blow shook the front doors, the metal frame now visibly buckling. "Deliberate containment patterns," Lewis replied, professional despite his obvious distress. "Like they've done this before, or planned it." The implication was clear and terrifying. If Lewis was right, this was no random encounter, no territorial animal responding to human encroachment. This was coordinated action with strategic intent. Before Reeves could process this fully, a new sound drew his attention. Breaking glass from the back of the building, followed by Chen's voice calling, "Out! Sheriff! They're coming in through the evidence room window!" The station, designed to withstand human intruders, had not been built with the strength and determination of 8-foot cryptids in mind. Reeves realized with sudden clarity that they were about to be overrun. "Fall back to the cells," he ordered, naming the most defensible section of the small station. "Bring the emergency kit and the sat phone." As Walker grabbed the duffel containing their emergency supplies, Reeves heard a tremendous crash from the evidence room, followed by heavy footsteps and the sound of equipment being overturned. Chen appeared in the hallway, backing toward them, with her weapon drawn, eyes fixed on something beyond Reeves's line of sight. "Move!" she urged, and then they were running, the three of them pounding down the corridor toward the holding area with its steel-reinforced doors and concrete walls. They made it just as the main doors finally gave way, the wood and metal exploding inward with a sound like a thunderclap. Walker secured the cell block door behind them as Reeves fumbled with the keys to the largest holding cell, ironically seeking safety in the same space they used to contain threats to public safety. Once inside, Walker dragged the heavy steel, caught against the bars as an additional barrier, while Chen established a defensive position covering the cell block entrance. Reeves used the satellite phone to update Mayor Hancock and coordinate with his deputies in the field. "They've breached the station," he reported tersely. "We're secure for now in the holding area. What's the status of the evacuation?" "Community center is filling up," the mayor responded, sounds of controlled chaos in the background. "About 60% of the alert zone residents accounted for. Tom, we're getting reports from all over the perimeter now. These things are everywhere, driving people toward the town center. But no direct attacks on civilians? No injuries? Not yet. It's like they're gathering us. God, that sounds insane. Even saying it out loud." Insane but increasingly difficult to deny, Reeves thought as he ended the call. The evidence was mounting that they faced something more complex and frightening than a few territorial wildlife specimens. The behavior displayed suggested planning, coordination, and worst of all, intelligence. From their secured position, they could hear the creatures moving through the station. Heavy footsteps, occasional crashes as furniture was overturned or Equipment knocked aside, and continuously those vocalizations. Clicks, whistles, grunts, and rumbles that formed patterns too consistent to be random. "They're searching for something," Chen observed in a whisper, watching the cell block door. "This isn't random destruction." As if to confirm her assessment, the sounds of movement became more methodical. They could hear drawers being opened in the main office area, file cabinets sliding, computer keyboards being experimentally pressed. What could they possibly want? Walker wondered, his voice barely audible. Before anyone could speculate, a new sound reached them. A low, resonant series of rumbles and clicks directly outside the cell block door. Then silence, as if whatever stood on the other side was listening, evaluating. The three officers held perfectly still, weapons trained on the door, barely breathing. For nearly a minute, the standoff continued in perfect silence. Then came a sound that sent ice through Reeves's veins, the metal scrape of the door handle being tried, followed by increasing pressure against the frame. It knows how doors work. Chen breathed, the scientific part of her mind still cataloging observations even in the face of mounting terror. The pressure increased, the reinforced frame groaning but holding. Then, suddenly, it stopped. They heard retreating footsteps, followed by what sounded like multiple creatures gathering in the main office area of the station. The vocalizations increased in tempo and complexity. A discussion Reeves couldn't help but think. A strategy session. "What are they doing?" Walker whispered, strain evident in his voice. "I don't know," Reeves admitted, "but stay alert. This isn't over." Indeed, within minutes they heard movement again, but not approaching the cell block. Instead, it sounded as if the creatures were focusing their attention on another area of the station. The armory, Reeves realized with sudden dread. They're trying to access the weapons locker. The implications were too horrifying to fully process. If these creatures understood the concept and use of human weaponry. But the sounds that followed suggested their efforts were unsuccessful. Frustrated growls, the shake of the reinforced armory door being tested but holding firm. Small mercies, Reeves thought, though he doubted the creatures would be deterred for long. Using the satellite phone, Reeves continued to coordinate with the outside. The evacuation was proceeding, with most residents now secured at the community center in the middle of town. State police had been notified and were mobilizing, but their nearest units were still over an hour away. Meanwhile, Deputies Orozco and Lewis reported that the creatures' perimeter around the northwest sector appeared to be contracting, as if they were gradually tightening their hold on the town. "It's a coordinated operation," Orozco reported, his voice tight with tension. "I've never seen anything like it. They're using vocalizations to communicate positions, maintaining sight lines with each other through the trees. Sheriff, we're dealing with tactics here." The situation was escalating beyond anything in Reeves's experience, beyond the training and protocols that had guided his law enforcement career. He found himself reaching for the worn leather journal he'd brought with them into the cell, the record of previous encounters kept by his predecessors. Flipping through it by the dim emergency light, he searched for any precedent, any insight into what might happen next. Most of the recorded incidents involved sightings, unusual tracks, or strange sounds. But one entry from 1943, during the height of World War II, caught his attention. His predecessor's cramped handwriting detailed how all logging operations in the area had suddenly been plagued by equipment failures, mysterious accidents, and workers refusing to enter certain areas of the forest after experiencing what they described as a feeling of being watched by something hostile. The situation had escalated until a lumber camp 5 miles from town was found abandoned one morning, the workers' belongings still in their cabins, half-eaten meals on tables, but not a single person remaining. A search party followed tracks, leading deep into the forest. Not just the huge footprints associated with Sasquatch sightings, but also the boot prints of the missing workers, suggesting they had walked into the forest voluntarily, or been compelled to do so. The search was abandoned after 2 members of the party disappeared overnight from a secured camp. No bodies were ever found, and the incident was officially attributed to labor disputes and desertion during wartime. But the sheriff's private notes told a different story, one of systematic pressure applied by forest entities until human presence was withdrawn from their territory. Was that happening again now? Was this some kind of territorial response? But that didn't explain the strategic gathering of townspeople at the community center, nor the specific targeting of the police station. A sudden crash from the main office area pulled Reeves from his thoughts. It sounded as if the creatures were systematically destroying the station's equipment, computers, radios, anything that might be used for communication or coordination. "They're isolating us," Chen observed, her scientific detachment slipping to reveal the fear underneath. "Cutting off communications, containing the population." "But why?" Walker demanded, his knuckles white around his service weapon. "What do they want?" Before Reeves could formulate a response, a new sound reached them, a rhythmic banging from somewhere outside the station, like metal striking metal in a deliberate pattern. It was joined by another, then another, until it seemed the sound was coming from all around the town. A signal, Reeves thought, or a countdown. The creatures inside the station responded immediately to this new development. They heard heavy footsteps rushing toward the exit, the remains of the front doors being pushed aside. Within moments, the station fell silent, the intruders apparently responding to the summons. "They're leaving?" Walker asked incredulously. "Regrouping," Reeves corrected, a cold certainty settling in his gut. This was just the first phase. As if to confirm his assessment, the satellite phone buzzed with an incoming call. It was Deputy Lewis, his voice tight with controlled panic. "Sheriff, you need to see this. They're gathering, all of them, forming a perimeter around the community center. At least 20, maybe more. But they're not attacking, they're just waiting. And Sheriff? People are starting to panic in here. We need instructions." In the cell at the Pinewood Creek Police Station, Sheriff Thomas Reeves faced the most difficult decision of his career. Outside, an impossibility was unfolding. Creatures that shouldn't exist were executing what appeared to be a coordinated operation against his town. His people were contained, his station compromised, and reinforcements still too far away to make an immediate difference. "Hold your positions," he instructed Lewis. "Keep everyone calm. Tell them." He paused, searching for words that could possibly address the unprecedented situation. "Tell them we're assessing the situation and we'll have a response plan shortly." As he ended the call, Reeves met the eyes of Deputies Chen and Walker. In their faces, he saw the same mixture of fear, determination, and disbelief that he knew must be evident in his own expression. "We need to get to the community center," he said finally. "Whatever this is, whatever they want, that's where it's going to happen." "How?" Walker gestured to the cell block door. "They could still be in the station, waiting for us." Reeves's mind raced through options, each seeming more desperate than the last. Then Chen spoke up, her analytical mind finding a possibility others might have overlooked. "The maintenance tunnels," she said. "The old storm drainage system runs right under the station, connects to most of the municipal buildings in town, including the community center." Reeves nodded slowly, hope kindling for the first time since the creatures had appeared in the parking lot. "Access point?" "Utility closet, back of the cell block. There's a maintenance hatch in the floor. It'll be tight, but we should be able to move through the system if we stay low." It was a desperate plan, but the only one available. As they prepared to leave the relative safety of the cell, gathering what weapons and equipment they could carry, Reeves found himself wondering what awaited them at the community center. What did these creatures want with the people of Pinewood Creek? And more disturbingly, what would happen when the townsfolk, gathered together and increasingly desperate, came face to face with the impossibilities that had emerged from their forest? The answers to these questions, Reeves suspected, would fundamentally change Pinewood Creek, and perhaps the world beyond, forever. As they moved toward the utility closet and the uncertain escape route it promised, the rhythmic banging continued throughout the town, like a primitive heartbeat counting down to an inevitable confrontation. The utility closet at the back of the cell block was cramped and filled with cleaning supplies and maintenance equipment that had likely been undisturbed for months. Deputy Chen pushed aside mops and buckets, revealing a square, metal hatch in the concrete floor, secured with a heavy padlock. "Keys?" she asked, looking to Sheriff Reeves. He produced the station's master key ring from his belt, sorting through the various keys until he found the small brass one marked Maintenance. The lock opened with a reluctant click after decades of disuse. "I can't believe I'm saying this," Walker muttered as they prepared to descend. "But I'm actually looking forward to crawling through sewers if it means getting away from those things." "Not sewers," Chen corrected, lifting the heavy hatch to reveal a narrow metal ladder descending into darkness. "Storm drainage. It should be relatively dry this time of year, before the summer thunderstorms." Reeves went first, the beam of his tactical flashlight illuminating a concrete tunnel about 5 feet in diameter. The air was cool and damp, with a musty odor of stagnant water and mineral deposits, but thankfully not the overpowering stench they had feared. Chen followed, then Walker, who carefully pulled the hatch closed behind them. "Which way?" Reeves asked, his voice echoing slightly in the confined space. Chen oriented herself, visualizing the municipal infrastructure maps she had studied during her initial training with the department. "East," she pointed. "We follow this main conduit about 300 yards. Then there's a junction. We take the north branch another 200 yards, and that should put us directly beneath the community center." They moved as quickly as possible, in the cramped conditions, hunched over to avoid scraping their heads on the concrete ceiling. Their flashlight beams created dancing shadows, transforming innocent maintenance markings and mineral stains into momentarily sinister shapes that set already frayed nerves further on edge. The rhythmic banging they had heard from inside the station was audible here too, transmitted through the ground and infrastructure above them. A steady, primitive pulse that seemed to beat in counterpoint to their racing hearts. Occasionally, they could feel vibrations through the concrete, like the impact of heavy footsteps directly overhead. "They're all through town now," Reeves observed grimly as they reached the junction Chen had described. Moving with purpose, the north branch was slightly narrower, forcing them to proceed in single file. Water trickled along the bottom of the tunnel, soaking their boots and making the footing treacherous in spots. They had covered perhaps half the distance to the community center when Deputy Walker, bringing up the rear, stopped suddenly. "Did you hear that?" he whispered, turning, to direct his flashlight back the way they had come. Reeves and Chen paused, listening intently. At first, there was nothing but the distant metallic banging and the soft trickle of water around their feet. Then, unmistakably, a sound that didn't belong. A soft scraping from the tunnel behind them, like something large moving cautiously through the confined space. "Kill the lights," Reeves ordered, and they were plunged into perfect darkness. In the blackness, their other senses heightened immediately. The sound came again, closer now. A deliberate movement, followed by what might have been breathing, deep and controlled. Something was in the tunnel with them, and it was moving in their direction. They found the hatch, Walker breathed, barely audible. "Move," Reeves responded, his voice equally soft. Quickly, but quietly. "Chen, lead the way." They proceeded by touch now, one hand on the curved wall of the tunnel, the other outstretched to prevent collisions as they moved as swiftly as possible toward the community center access point. Behind them, the sounds of pursuit grew more distinct. Heavy, movement, an occasional grunt or snuffle, and most disturbingly, a rhythmic series of clicks that seemed to be communicating their position to others. "They're tracking us by sound and scent," Chen whispered as they hurried forward. "The darkness doesn't disadvantage them at all." The implications were chilling. These creatures, whatever they were, possessed senses acute enough to follow humans through absolute darkness in an environment that should have been completely foreign to forest dwellers. It spoke of adaptability and intelligence far beyond what most would attribute to an undocumented primate species. After what felt like an eternity but was probably less than 5 minutes, Chen's outstretched hand encountered a vertical metal ladder. "Here," she hissed. "The access point." Above them was another hatch, this one leading up into the community center's utility room. Reeves climbed first, working by touch to locate the internal release mechanism that would open the hatch from below. The sounds of pursuit were closer now, perhaps 50 yards behind them and closing rapidly. The hatch mechanism was stiff with disuse, and for a heart-stopping moment, Reeves thought it might be secured from above. Then, with a grudging metallic groan, it gave way. He pushed upward, raising the heavy cover just enough to peer into the space above. He found himself looking into a small, cluttered utility room filled with water heaters, electrical panels, and maintenance supplies. It was empty of people, or creatures, and a thin strip of light showed beneath the door leading to the rest of the building. "Clear," he whispered down, then pushed the hatch fully open and climbed into the room. Chen followed swiftly, with Walker close behind, constantly, glancing back at the darkness they had emerged from. Once all three were safely in the utility room, they carefully lowered the hatch back into place. Walker immediately began dragging heavy objects onto it. A toolbox, chemical containers, anything that might slow down pursuers coming up from below. "That won't hold them for long," Reeves observed grimly, checking his service weapon before approaching the utility room door. "But maybe long enough." Outside the door, they could hear the sounds of the community center in crisis. Hundreds of voices raised in a mixture of confusion, fear, and mounting panic, punctuated by the occasional authoritative shout as deputies and town officials attempted to maintain order. Underneath it all, still audible even here, was that relentless rhythmic banging from outside the building, like a tribal drum signaling the start of some ancient and terrible ceremony. Reeves eased the door open a crack, surveying the scene beyond. The utility room opened onto a service corridor that ran behind the main gathering space of the community center. Through a set of double doors at the end of the corridor, he could see a portion of the main hall packed with townsfolk. Men, women, and children, many still in night clothes, their faces etched with confusion and fear. Moving cautiously down the service corridor, the three officers approached the double doors. Through the small windows in each door, they could now see most of the main hall. Nearly 1,000 people were crowded into a space designed for perhaps half that number. Deputies Orozco and Lewis were visible at the far end of the room, working with Mayor Hancock to organize the chaos. The town's volunteer firefighters had also responded to the emergency, forming a perimeter around the frightened civilians and maintaining some semblance of order. "No obvious points of entry from the forest side," Chen observed, peering through the window. "At least they've secured the building properly." "For all the good that will do if those things decide to force their way in," Walker responded. "You saw what they did to the station doors." Reeves didn't comment, his attention caught by something outside the community center's large windows. From their angle, they could see only a portion of the town square that the building fronted onto. But what was visible confirmed their worst fears. Massive, shadowy figures moved methodically around the perimeter of the square, just at the edge of the illumination provided by the town's streetlights. They seemed to be establishing positions, creating a cordon around the community center. "What are they waiting for?" Walker wondered aloud, tension evident in every line of his body. Before anyone could speculate, the double doors swung open as Deputy Orozco stepped into the service corridor, his hand instinctively moving to his weapon. At the unexpected movement, recognition dawned immediately, and the tension in his face gave way to momentary relief. "Sheriff, we thought you were trapped at the station." The relief faded quickly as he registered their disheveled state and the grim determination in Reeves's expression. "How bad is it out there?" "Worse than we thought," Reeves replied tersely, leading his small group through the doors into the main hall. "They've surrounded the entire town center. Coordinated tactics, organized positioning. This isn't random, Miguel." As they moved toward the raised platform at the end of the hall where Mayor Hancock was attempting to address the crowd, their appearance caused a ripple of reaction, hope at seeing the sheriff, quickly tempered by the reality of their small number and obvious distress. "Thank God!" the mayor exclaimed as they reached her, the microphone in her hand momentarily forgotten. "Tom, what's happening? We've got reports coming in from all over town. People saying they were herded here by creatures that shouldn't exist," Reeves supplied grimly. "Those reports are accurate. They've taken the station, disabled our communications, and systematically driven the population to this central location. Now they have us surrounded." The mayor's face paled. "But why? What do they want?" It was the question that had been haunting Reeves since the first reports of unusual activity in the forest. What possible motivation could explain this unprecedented behavior from creatures that, according to conventional understanding, were either mythical or, at best, rare and reclusive primates? Before he could formulate a response, a young woman pushed her way through the crowd toward them, her face flushed with urgency. It took Reeves a moment to recognize Dr. Rebecca Lansing, the new head of the small Natural History Museum and Research Center that had been established in Pinewood Creek 5 years earlier. "Sheriff Reeves," she called, slightly out of breath from the effort of navigating the dense crowd. "I think I might know what's happening, or at least I have a theory." All eyes turned to the scientist, a petite woman in her mid-30s whose usual composed academic demeanor had been replaced by barely contained excitement despite the circumstances. "Dr. Lansing," Reeves acknowledged, gesturing for her to continue. "The timing," she said, her words tumbling out rapidly. "It's not random. April 22nd, the day before the start of the Silvertip Mining Company's exploratory operation in the Northwest Forest Quadrant." Comprehension dawned on Reeves's face. The mining operation had been a contentious issue in Pinewood Creek for months. After extensive lobbying and a series of rather suspicious regulatory approvals, Silvertip had secured permission to begin exploratory drilling for rare earth minerals in a previously untouched section of the forest. Environmental groups had protested, lawsuits had been filed, but ultimately the economic arguments had prevailed. The operation was scheduled to begin at dawn the next morning. Heavy equipment and personnel were already staged at the forest edge, ready to create an access road and establish the first drilling sites. "You think this is about the mining operation?" Mayor Hancock asked incredulously. "That's absurd. How would they even know?" "They've always known," Dr. Lansing cut in, her academic authority momentarily overriding the mayor's political position. "That's what my research has been suggesting. Analysis of historical incident patterns, tribal, oral histories, and ecological anomalies all point to the same conclusion. These beings, Sasquatch if you want to use the popular term, aren't just animals. They're intelligent, organized, and they've been monitoring human activities in this region for centuries." The assembled town officials exchanged skeptical glances, but Sheriff Reeves found himself considering the possibility seriously. It would explain the coordinated nature of the current incident, the strategic targeting of communications infrastructure, and the containment of the population. "If that's true," he said slowly, "then this is a defensive action. They're responding to a perceived threat to their territory." "Exactly," Dr. Lansing nodded vigorously. "But it's more than just territory. The Northwest Quadrant contains geological formations that are completely unique to this region. My team has documented unusual electromagnetic properties, unexplained, temperature anomalies, and botanical specimens that exist nowhere else on Earth. Whatever Silvertip is hoping to extract, It's part of a larger ecosystem that is fundamentally important to these beings. Deputy Chen, with her background in wildlife biology, was following the scientist's reasoning closely. You're suggesting some kind of symbiotic relationship between these creatures and the specific environment of the Northwest Quadrant. More than symbiotic, Lansing replied. I think it's essential to them, and based on what we're seeing tonight, they're willing to reveal themselves, something they've avoided for centuries, to protect it. The implications were staggering. If Lansing was right, they weren't dealing with animals defending hunting grounds, or even intelligent primates protecting a habitat. They were facing beings with a complex understanding of human society, enough awareness of human activities to know about scheduled mining operations, and the organizational capacity to mount what amounted to a tactical response. Before they could fully process this theory, a deafening crack split the air outside the community center. The rhythmic banging that had been constant for the past hour suddenly ceased, replaced by an eerie silence. Then, with a synchronicity that sent chills down the spines of everyone present, every light in the building went out simultaneously. In the momentary darkness and confusion that followed, screams and shouts erupted from the crowd. Emergency lighting flickered on seconds later, casting weak yellowish illumination across the sea of frightened faces. Reeves immediately took charge, his voice cutting through the rising panic. Everyone remain calm. Deputies, secure the entrances. Firefighters, maintain the perimeter around civilians. As his orders were being carried out, a new sound reached them, a scraping, splintering noise from the community center's main entrance. The heavy wooden doors, reinforced with metal and secured with industrial-grade deadbolts, were visibly shuddering under tremendous external pressure. They're coming in, Walker said unnecessarily, his voice tight as he drew his weapon. Reeves made a swift decision. Dr. Lansing, if your theory is correct, they don't want to harm the population. They want to prevent the mining operation. Mayor Hancock, where are the Silvertip executives staying? The mayor's eyes widened as she grasped his thinking. The Mountain View Lodge, on the east side of town. They're scheduled for a final briefing with their operational team at 6 a.m. before proceeding to the site. Another tremendous impact shook the main doors, one of the hinges visibly tearing from the frame. Whatever was coming through wasn't going to be stopped by conventional barriers. We need to contact them, Reeves said urgently. Convince them to delay the operation at minimum. It might be the only way to defuse this situation before someone gets hurt. All outside communications are down, Deputy Lewis reminded him. Phone lines, cell service, internet, all disabled. And even if we could reach them, do you really think a multinational mining corporation is going to abandon a multi-million-dollar operation because of this? He gestured helplessly at the failing doors. It was a valid point. Corporate interests rarely yielded to local concerns under normal circumstances, let alone a situation as unbelievable as a coordinated action by creatures whose very existence was not officially recognized. Then we need to get to them in person, Reeves decided. Dr. Lansing, you're coming with me. Your expertise might help convince them, or at least provide a scientific framework they can understand. Deputies Chen and Walker, you'll accompany. Us, Orozco and Lewis, remain here with the mayor and maintain order. And how exactly do you plan to get across town? Mayor Hancock demanded. In case you haven't noticed, we're surrounded. Before Reeves could respond, the main doors gave way, with a final splintering crash. The crowd surged backward with a collective cry of terror as an enormous figure stepped through the ruined entrance. Standing over 8 feet tall, its massive frame covered in thick, rusty brown fur, the creature paused just inside the doorway, surveying the room with eyes that gleamed with intelligence in the dim emergency lighting. Its features were a disquieting blend of primate and human, a heavy brow ridge over deep-set eyes, a broad nose, and a mouth that seemed capable of more expressive movements than any known animal. Behind it, more massive shapes became visible, at least a dozen crowding at the entrance but not yet entering. They communicated with those subtle clicks and rumbles, creating patterns that even the untrained human ear could recognize as language. The Kyusho lead creature took another step forward, its movement surprisingly graceful for something of such size. The crowd pressed further back, a wave of human fear almost palpable in the air. Deputies Orozco and Lewis had their weapons trained on the intruder, but they looked to Sheriff Reeves for guidance, clearly reluctant to fire the first shot in what could quickly become a massacre. In that moment of teetering uncertainty, Dr. Lansing did something either incredibly brave or incredibly foolish. She stepped forward, moving away from the protection of the officers and into the open space, between the crowd and the massive intruder. "Wait!" she called out, raising her hands to demonstrate their emptiness. "Please, we need to communicate." The lead creature's gaze fixed on her, its head tilting slightly in what might have been curiosity. It made no threatening movement, but neither did it retreat. Lansing turned partially back toward Reeves and the others while keeping the creature in her peripheral vision. "This is our chance," she said urgently. "This isn't an attack. It's a first contact scenario. They've been pushed to this point by our encroachment, but they're trying to communicate, not destroy." As if to underscore her point, the creature reached slowly into a kind of crude pouch or bag that hung at its side. The deputies tensed, weapons raising slightly, but Sheriff Reeves held up a hand, silently ordering them to hold fire. With deliberate movements, the creature withdrew something from the pouch and held it forward in an outstretched hand. In the poor lighting, it took a moment for them to recognize what it was displaying. A folded map, weathered and creased, but unmistakably a geological survey map of the Northwest Forest Quadrant. The very area where Silvertip Mining planned to begin operations in the morning. The creature extended its arm further, clearly offering the map to whoever would take it. Dr. Lansing began to move forward, but Sheriff Reeves gently caught her arm, stepping up beside her. "Together," he said quietly. "Whatever happens next, we face it together." As they approached the massive being that stood like a nightmare made flesh in the doorway of the Pinewood Creek Community Center, the fate of not only the town, but potentially, of human understanding about the natural world hung in the balance. Behind them, nearly 1,000 citizens watched in stunned silence. Outside, more of the creatures waited, their purpose still not fully understood. And across town, oblivious to the unfolding confrontation, executives from Silvertip Mining slept, peacefully, dreaming of profit from resources they had no idea were under the protection of something far more ancient and powerful than any corporate interest. The moment stretched, pregnant with possibility and danger. Sheriff Thomas Reeves, a man who had built his life on protecting the known and predictable, reached out his hand to accept the offered map from a being whose existence challenged everything he thought he understood about the world. As their hands almost touched, he couldn't help but wonder, was this the end of the night's terrors, or just the beginning of something even more profound? Sheriff Reeves accepted the map with steady hands, his eyes never leaving the enormous creature's face. As their fingers briefly touched, human skin against rough, calloused pads, a current of understanding seemed to pass between them. The Sasquatch's eyes, deep-set and startlingly intelligent, conveyed a message more profound than words could express. Dr. Lansing stepped forward, carefully unfolding the map on a nearby table. What they saw left them speechless. The geological survey was covered with additional markings in a reddish-brown substance, highlighting specific areas with complex symbols. But most startling was the intricate network of passages clearly drawn beneath the surface, a vast system of tunnels and caverns that no human survey had ever documented. "My God," Lansing breathed. "It's a habitat, an entire underground ecosystem. The mining operation would collapse it all." The lead Sasquatch made a series of deliberate sounds, watching them intently as if willing them to understand. It gestured toward the map, then to the children in the crowd, then to its own chest. They're not just protecting territory, Chen realized. They're protecting their future. Their children. Understanding crashed over Reeves like a wave. This wasn't an attack. It was a desperate plea from one intelligent species to another. "We need to reach the mining executives immediately," he decided. "Dr. Lansing, explain what we've learned. Mayor Hancock, prepare to declare a state of emergency, if necessary." What followed was a night of frantic diplomacy as Reeves and Lansing, escorted by 2 Sasquatch guides, made their way across town to the Mountain View Lodge. The mining executives, rudely awakened and initially dismissive, found their skepticism crumbling in the face of irrefutable evidence, both the map and the living proof towering in the hotel lobby. By dawn, an unprecedented agreement had been reached. Silvertip Mining would halt operations pending a full environmental survey, one that would include input from Dr. Lansing and acknowledge the previously undocumented ecosystem beneath the forest. As the sun rose over Pinewood Creek, the Sasquatch departed as mysteriously as they had arrived, melting back into the forest that had hidden them for centuries. They left behind a town forever changed, the first human community to establish knowing contact with a species that had deliberately remained hidden throughout human history. In the years that followed, Pinewood Creek would become the center of a new scientific discipline, one dedicated to communication and cooperation with our evolutionary cousins. The events of April 22, 2025, initially reported as an attack, would eventually be recognized as something far more significant: first contact. Sheriff Thomas Reeves, who had entered that night believing only in what he could see and touch, stood at the forest's edge watching the last of the massive figures disappear among the trees. The world had become larger overnight, more mysterious and more wondrous than he had ever imagined. And deep in his heart, he knew that the forest would keep some secrets still,